Hello and a very warm welcome to the third day of Bruegel's annual meeting. It's a real pleasure to host this first session today on the role of the EU's trade strategy for an inclusive and sustainable recovery. We are very pleased and honored to have with us today Valdis Dombrovskis. He is the Executive Vice President of the European Commission for an economy that works for the people and is in charge of a number of very important files such as trade policy, but also the economic policies and the financial policies. So very big and important files. And he wants to talk with us today about both the trade strategy, but also about the recovery. Now, we've had also quite a number of discussions already on the recovery, but we do want to start with the trade strategy. And with me is also today Alicia Garcia-Herrero, who is a senior fellow at Bruegel and who is joining us today, I believe, from Taipei, Alicia, or from Hong Kong. I don't even know actually where you are right now. But she wanted to be here but couldn't make it because of the tough quarantine rules that the Asian countries are now imposing on her way back. She would have had to be in a prison basically for 3 weeks, and so we wanted to avoid that. So it's really great to have you with us and to discuss the EU's trade strategy and then of course the recovery. And thank you so much, Vice President, for joining us for this first session of the third day. So Valdis, perhaps I can start asking you about the EU's trade strategy, where it stands at the moment, where you would put an accent in the next, let's say, 2-3 years, in view of creating a resilient recovery.
Good morning, everyone. So thank you, Guntram and Alicia. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I highly appreciate Bruegel's role to the European public debate. I have participated in many Bruegel events before, but it's the first time since I took over the trade portfolio. I view trade as one of Europe's fundamental strengths. It is one of our key sources of competitiveness in the global marketplace. And we will need this competitive advantage to emerge from COVID-19 crisis. The faster European companies will start to trade and innovate, the better our recovery will be. Unfortunately, there are still voices that urge that Europe should turn inward, but I believe that we should be building trade bridges, not trade walls. And I think it makes sense to stay open, given the fact that 85% of global growth will take place outside the EU in the next decade. And our single market is significant source of strengths and a strong magnet for trade. So let me just give some data. We are the world's largest exporter of manufactured goods and services, and the biggest export market for around 80 countries. We have the largest network of bilateral trade deals, 46 deals with 78 partners, and we are actually generating a substantial trade surplus, around 300 billion euros at last count. Our trade performance will thus help us to recover faster and better. Trade is also more important for EU employment than ever before. 38 million European jobs depend on exports, actually showing an increase of 9 million jobs over the last decade. This means that almost 1 in 5 jobs, so 18% to be precise, of total EU employment are linked with EU exports to non-EU countries. And those are also better paying jobs, about 12% higher than average. So going forward, trade will support more high quality jobs also for the next generation. But we bring more than this to the table. We bring also credibility and reliability. This matters because Europe can credibly claim to be the world's most trusted trading partner. Countries around the globe and also in the region value our commitment to stable, predictable, rules-based trade. This provides with substantial geopolitical advantage. In other words, our strong trade relationships can help us to achieve our wider ambitions, thus becoming the world's first climate neutral continent, or becoming the standard setter for the digital transformation of the economy, which will become an ever more important part of our trade agenda in near future. So since I took over as a trade commissioner, we have taken a number of important steps in this respect. So we have reset the transatlantic relationship, both bilaterally in a context provided shared global leadership. We have published a new trade strategy designed to be open, sustainable, and assertive. We have generated the momentum for a WTO reform. We have taken strong steps to ensure that our trade policy is actively supporting our climate and sustainability goals. And we are strengthening our tools to protect ourselves, to defend our values when our partners do not play by the rules. So using trade tools to ensure a stronger Europe in the world without weaponizing trade. But let me be very clear, making further progress to achieve these ambitions will require hard choices. If we take contribution of trade policy to our climate goals an example, our new trade policy strategy is without doubt the greenest ever. So concretely, we are bringing forward climate and sustainability initiatives at the WTO, negotiating and implementing ambitious trade and sustainable development chapters in our trade deals, seeking commitments from biggest emitters, so specifically G20 countries on climate neutrality, making the respect of Paris Agreement as an essential element in our trade negotiations, bringing strong autonomous measures like a WTO-compliant carbon border adjustment mechanism, mandatory due diligence legislation to deal with serious environmental or human rights violations, including forced labor, new legislation to avoid placing products deriving from deforestation on the market. And also will update the generalized scheme of preferences later this month, which will help us to work with our developing countries partners to meet the targets of Paris Agreement and other environmental conventions. These are concrete trade policy expressions on EU climate leadership. It is clear that achieving those goals will present real challenges both within the EU and with our trading partners. But if we want to fight climate change, not just to talk about, these are the steps we have to take. Of course, we will encounter many teething problems, and for sure there will be opposition from our global partners when new obligations and standards are being placed on them. So we'll need to tread carefully if we want to credibly lead the alliance of like-minded countries to address global challenges. We cannot push trade partners away, but we need to continue to act cooperatively while being clear that respect of certain values are fundamental conditions for continuing the trade with the EU, which is the world's largest trading bloc. So to conclude, I hope I have given you insight on the new direction of the EU trade policy and how it can support inclusive and sustainable recovery. So thank you very much, and I will be open to your questions and comments.
Alicia, perhaps you want to directly jump in, and let me also mention to our audience, if you want to ask a question, please go on Slido and type in the code BAM21, so Bruegel Annual Meeting 21 Trade. Alicia, please. We can't hear you.
Yes, thank you for the introductory words. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think you can. Yeah, hopefully. It's been fascinating to realize while listening to you how important Europe is for the world as far as trade is concerned. And having said that, of course, in a way, we're using trade so much because we lack other policies, don't we? We lack external foreign policy and others. And I just wonder, really hearing you, whether we can really do so much with trade as you just mentioned. I mean, what's the risk of overburdening our trade policy by hoping that we can solve problems that are all absolutely marvelous to be solved, such as climate change, but that might need additional policies that the European Union, unfortunately, hasn't managed to pull together, and especially, of course, foreign policy. So I'd like to hear your views about that.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, this is something which we need to be mindful of. In the first part of my introductory remarks, I outlined how important trade is for EU's economy and for job creation in the EU. So trade is first and foremost economic policy, and it's very important economically for the EU. So therefore, indeed, it's important that we find the right balance. We can use our leverage. We are the world's largest single market to also advance other policies with the help of trade policy. But of course, we need to find the right balance, exactly as you said, not to overburden the trade policy. And as I also said, we need to tread carefully with our partners internationally. In a sense, we cannot be seen as pushing them around, imposing all kind of new things on our partners. So also there, we need to be careful, and when advancing our agenda, for example, our sustainability agenda, to do it also in a way that is compatible with the World Trade Organization rules, also with the commitments we have taken in our bilateral agreements. So it's a careful balance to be found. We want to use trade policy to promote also other policies and our sustainability agenda. At the same time, we must respect international rules, because we are very clear, and we reiterated this commitment also in a new trade policy strategy, that we stay committed to multilateralism and open, fair and rules-based trade. So it's basically about finding the right balance.
But Valdis, can I push you a little bit more on this point that Alicia is making? I mean, I think it's really an important question. I mean, how far can we go in using trade policy when pursuing other objectives with third countries? I mean, and I think Alicia's point really that contrary to sort of traditional single country entities where trade policy, foreign policy, military policy are more or less aligned because they are run by one government. Here we have a strange situation in Europe because we have a sort of the centralization. We talked about this yesterday also with Sabine Weyand. We have the centralization of trade policy, so majority voting on trade policy, but in foreign policy we do not have that. And so how far can we use this trade policy instrument, sort of thinking of an old, sorry for mentioning an academic economist, the Tinbergen principle. So you have one instrument to pursue one policy. And now we have one instrument, which is trade policy, to pursue all kinds of objectives. And yesterday we also had, if I can say so, we had the WTO Director General here presenting at Bruegel, and she was also talking about, well, how can we now include gender issues, for example, in trade policy. And so I think the question is really, how far can one go? How many goals can one pursue with just one instrument?
First of all, it's true that trade policy has its own goals and objectives as an economic policy, as a way also to support economic growth and job creation. So this is a basis which we really need to keep in mind. So then I wouldn't be as pessimistic. Of course, EU has also different policies, common foreign security policy. Of course, it's indeed unanimity, and decision-making thus is more complicated. Unfortunately, quite often we also see the push to move back in a trade policy to unanimity, and we are, as a European Commission, defending it as a common European policy, so we should not really renationalize a trade policy. It's also clearly linked with the EU single market. So these are the basics which, of course, we need to remember. Then, at the same time, we are already using trade policy to advance also other goals. That's why each modern trade agreement, already concluded trade agreement, has also ambitious trade and sustainable development chapter. And actually, recently, we also had an example with South Korea, where we were using this trade and sustainable development chapter to make sure that South Korea is ratifying and implementing fundamental ILO, International Labour Organization foundations. So it's something we are already using. Now, of course, in a context of European Green Deal, it's in a sense an overarching issue. So we need to see how different policies can contribute to this objective. And indeed, there are ways how trade can do this. I mentioned also our initiatives at the WTO on trade and climate. We are strengthening also, looking how to strengthen the implementation of enforcement of our trade and sustainable development chapters. We link our negotiations with respect of the Paris Agreement, but I think those are all realistic objectives, something which we can achieve. But of course, we need also to listen to our global partners, to listen to their concerns, to see how we can address them. Once again, I can just reiterate, for me, it's a question of finding the right balance, because I agree with you, this risk is there. If we just keep loading everything on trade policy, at one moment we may arrive at the point where we are not able to pursue trade policy itself, and thus not reaching also other goals, basically becoming economically less relevant, and also having less leverage vis-a-vis third countries in achieving our own goals. So in a sense, we really cannot overstretch this approach.
Alicia?
Yes, maybe, I mean, I fully understand your approach to this question, because you basically have two hats, and you also want growth for Europe. We all want that. And you know, a lot of what Europe wants to do is put on the one instrument that works the best, which is trade. But I'm going to put my Asian hat here, if you allow me. And I'm going to think of, you know, a pragmatic Chinese, as anybody here in Taipei or in the mainland for that matter. And the question they would ask you, if they could ask you a direct question, by the way, would be, how much does it cost for me? I'm an exporter. What's the label, the price label that you need to give me for protecting, labor rights in South Korea. You see what I mean? Like, I just think that because this is for the people, yeah, I mean, you just said it. This is European policies for the people. These people might one day ask us, how much does it cost to protect others? And to be frank, I agree with it, but I'm just saying, if we put ourselves out of our context, in other people's mind, in other countries' mind, this has a cost, because when you sit in the negotiations, you need to choose whether to lower tariffs, whether to have market access, you name it, as opposed to labor rights elsewhere, not in Europe, elsewhere. So at some point in time, I think these questions are going to be asked, and we'd better have a good answer. That's all from my side.
Indeed, the question is, when we are advancing other goals with the support of our trade policy, it implies certain new obligations on our trading partners, and it has certain costs. So, of course, something which the trading partners need to take into account when negotiating with the EU. Of course, from the EU side, the issue is to manage it carefully, not to come with overly burdensome, so to say, asks from our side, which could lead to our trade partners, in a sense, not concluding agreements. Certainly, it's a balance. But for example, you mentioned specifically labor rights. As regards labor rights, basically in our trade and sustainable development chapters, we are insisting on the respect and implementation of fundamental international labor organization standards. So those are international standards which sets basically the basis for labor rights, which we think should be respected globally. That's the aim also of the International Labour Organization, and those are international standards. So it's not something that we are imposing from the EU side, saying this is, we are not trying to export our socio-economic model and our, say, public bargaining model and all the aspects to third countries. We are, in a sense, insisting on the respect of fundamental ILO conventions. And we see that by and large, our trade partners are willing to take these kind of commitments, which are anyway international commitments, in order to conclude trade agreements with the EU.
Alicia, do you want to ask one more question on
yes.
China or trade?
Sorry.
And
yes.
then we move to the recovery.
Yes. Final one. I was thinking, that if we are to negotiate with a small economy, I don't know, we say we actually concluded trade deal with Singapore, saying nothing wrong with Singapore, but say the cost associated might be low because basically Singapore is a taker on all of these conventions. But if we move to China, the cost might be quite different because China might not be a taker of all of these international conventions that China actually argues were set by others, not necessarily by China. And, we could go on and on. So I would first want to hear from you, how much leverage do we have, how costly it is to impose not our values, but as you rightly pointed out, international values. It so happens that China might not agree. These are international, they are Western values. But on top of that, I like to know whether there would be a less costly option, which would be to create clubs. And you did mention, of course, an alliance of like-minded, there's many names for that, clubs perhaps for climate change. But the point is, making sure that you have more leverage so as that the cost of using that leverage goes down. Perhaps not all the way to existing multilateral organizations, because we know that that's where, you know, the impasse comes about, and we can't really move forward. What about clubs, basically? What about getting more on board with these requirements?
Well, yes. So let's first come to this question on China. And there, I would like to remind that China actually agreed on a same kind of obligations as South Korea has agreed in a trade and sustainable development, or okay, in this case, sustainable development chapter of comprehensive agreement of investment with China. We negotiated it for several years and concluded in principle in December last year. And indeed, this sustainable development part was also one of the difficult topics. As you can imagine, there were many difficult topics when we were negotiating with China, but this was one of the difficult topics. But eventually, we managed to agree also on those sustainable development commitments from China. We know that now the ratification process of comprehensive agreement of investment is not really moving forward because of human rights sanctions which were imposed against China and China's retaliatory sanctions. And the European Parliament has made it clear, as long as members of European Parliament are under Chinese sanctions, it will not proceed with even evaluating, not even saying ratification of the comprehensive agreement on investment. But it's in a sense a broader political issue. But if we look specifically on the agreement, actually China was agreeing on these kind of sustainable development commitments. Well, then you mentioned this approach on clubs. Obviously they are clubs of like-minded partners, and from that point of view, the EU and the single market, one could also say, is one such club. We're now advancing bilateral relations with US. We will be setting up, having the inaugural meeting of Trade and Technology Council with the United States later this month. We are cooperating in trilateral format with US and Japan. We have Ottawa group within the World Trade Organization of like-minded countries. So there are many examples. There are association countries in the EU's neighborhood which are integrating closer with the EU. So there are all kind of also initiatives of more closer links, more closer integration with EU standards. But then you mentioned the Club for Climate Change. Well, that's probably not an option, because climate change is a global challenge. So it's not something we can resolve just in one club. For example, EU is creating 9% global emissions. So even if EU were to go climate neutral in itself, it will not be enough. It will not stop climate change. So there we really need international cooperation, and first and foremost cooperation from the biggest emitters. That's why I was emphasizing this issue of seeking climate neutrality from G20 partners. And by the way, China has committed to climate neutrality by 2060.
I mean, if I may, on this topic, and also remind our audience that you can ask me questions, ask the Vice President questions by going on Slido and typing the code BAM21Trade. And there is, of course, already a couple of questions on trade, but so I want to ask one or two to you, but then we want to also discuss a bit the recovery in the European Union. But I think on trade, I think one sort of set of issues that really comes up is on the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the likelihood of its implementation. And you mentioned that the idea of a club doesn't work because we need the rest of the world. Well, the idea of the original Nordhaus Climate Club is exactly that such a club would incentivize the rest of the world to accelerate decarbonization efforts. And in a sense, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is not just about level playing field, it's also providing incentives for others to move ahead with faster decarbonization. So I think I agree with you that a carbon border adjustment mechanism that only is done at the EU level without any other countries participating is probably not going to be very effective. But shouldn't we aim for a broad and comprehensive climate club with carbon border adjustment, including the US and ideally also China? Where do you see this debate on the climate club, the carbon border adjustment, and the likelihood of some progress in the coming years?
First of all, it's worth noting that different countries are taking different approaches to tackling the climate change, and therefore we probably will not have like one single approach. If you look at the approach US is taking or China is taking, on many aspects they are different approaches. For example, we would not expect to have like universal price of carbon across the EU in a nearest, across the US in a nearest future. There are different ways US is approaching climate change. So I agree that would be a good scenario if the emission trading system would be a global emission trading system, creating on one hand a global level playing field, on the other hand clearly giving incentive to all countries to do their part of fighting against climate change. But we are not there, at least yet, so we have to act within the international reality which we are facing. Of course, with carbon border adjustment mechanism, we indeed are providing additional incentive for third countries to follow this approach on a setting price on carbon. But also there, we were having many questions, many concerns from our international partners. And we had to be careful that when we propose carbon border adjustment mechanism, that it's WTO compliant. And there's a key word is non-discrimination. In a sense, we cannot put exporters to the EU in worse situation than our own producers. So we cannot create double protection for EU industry, because frankly, there were calls saying, yes, carbon border adjustment mechanism, very interesting, but we want to keep our free emission allocations. Now it's clear that those free emission allocations for energy intensive industries will be phased out as of 2026. And as of 2026, we actually start imposing real payments on carbon border adjustment mechanism, and we will be factoring in the price of carbon through emission trading scheme or other mechanisms, which will be in third countries. So in a sense, to put a simple, if third countries will have an emission pricing system which is equivalent to ours, then those country exporters would not be facing this carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Perhaps one last, I can't resist on the trade front. Can you say one last word perhaps on the EU-US trade relation? I mean, there's of course also a question here by Philip Blenkinsop on the steel tariffs. And he says that you apparently recently said that you should look at other options if the US doesn't remove the steel tariffs. So what can we do to normalize the trading relation with the United States? These steel tariffs are still there, even though we have a new president, and even though the justification for them was never very clear, at least not very reasonable. So what do we do on the EU-US trade relation?
Well, on EU-US trade relationship, it must be said that now with Biden administration, we are certainly on a better track than we were with Trump administration. So there is much more engagement, much more cooperation. We managed to resolve Airbus-Boeing dispute. We are now in a course of setting up a Trade and Technology Council where we will cooperate in those areas on new emerging technologies, on international standard setting. And as regards steel and aluminium tariffs, this was also one of the conclusions of EU-US summit to work with a view of resolving this issue by the end of the year. And it must be said that after EU-US summit, I'm more optimistic that the solution will be found. So we are now engaging closely with relevant departments in US administration. And I hope that the solution will indeed be found.
Wonderful. Alicia, I don't know if you have another trade question. Otherwise, I would want to move on and discuss next generation EU and the strategic outlook in that space. Alicia, did you?
I'm afraid I do. Unfortunately, sorry to keep you on this one.
Please, one last.
Yes, very quickly. I feel by looking at what the UK has been doing since Brexit, that yes, we have a number of deals, of course, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, lovely. We may not end up having a deal with China. I mean, we could talk about why, I mean, what we want. That would be another question I would have. But beyond that, I like to know what's our mindset on Asia more generally, because as I said, the UK is now moving quite quickly on CPTPP. India, of course, we've started our own negotiations with India, but can we keep the pace? That's my question, because we can't miss Asia. We just can't. And Asia doesn't end in a comprehensive investment agreement with China, because as we all know, it's a tiny bit of what we could be negotiating with China. Of course, trade is excluded. I mean, the market access that we've gained, in my humble opinion, is not massive, let alone the fact that it might not be ratified. So we need to go ahead and find a way for Asia. And in that regard, the Biden administration, which is not doing any better so far, is thinking of this idea in the very same way as they are coming to us with this pact on technology. They're doing the same with Asia. They're coming with the idea of a digital deal. So I'd like to hear what's our plan for the largest region and fastest growing region in the world.
Indeed, as regards Asia, actually, EU is attaching a lot of attention to the region, because as you rightly outlined, indeed, it's an global economic powerhouse, so it's important we engage. We also know that in a few years' time, China is set to become the biggest economy in the world. So clearly, those are all developments which we cannot ignore. So as regards Asia, we already have trade deals in place with Japan, with Vietnam, with South Korea, with Singapore. We are in advanced stages of negotiation if we discuss broader Asia-Pacific region with Australia and New Zealand. We recently agreed to relaunch trade negotiations with India. We continue negotiations with Indonesia. So there's actually a lot of things happening in our relations with Asia. On China, well, we have agreement in principle on this investment agreement. However, this is something which we cannot see outside the context of broader political developments in EU-China relations. So this is in itself a very important question, because it's also true that when we discuss China, that we are also seeing many challenges in our economic relations, like, for example, questions related to industrial subsidies and transparency of industrial subsidies, a role of state-owned enterprises in the economy and their competitive neutrality, forced technology transfers, intellectual property rights. There are many issues we need to address, either bilaterally. There were a number of useful elements in this regard in comprehensive agreement on investment, or through the reform of the World Trade Organization. There are a number of elements which we put forward there in our proposals for WTO reform. Also in cooperation with other countries like with US, also trilaterally with Japan. So it's clear that we will need to find a way how exactly to engage with China, because we will not be able to ignore the fact that China will be the biggest economy, and already now China is the biggest emitter. So from that point of view, if we want to fight climate change, once again, we need to cooperate with China.
All right, wonderful. So I promised that we would also talk a bit about your other portfolios, and the very important one is, of course, Next Generation EU that is now being rolled out. We have had already a chance in the last 2 days to talk about the Spanish program, about the Polish, but also about the Italian program. And the Italian is, of course, the biggest one of all of them. And I guess what I would like to hear from you is the broader picture, the big picture. So beyond the individual countries, how do we ensure that Next Generation EU really is a transformative project that generates growth? And how do we measure, you know, that it has been successful? So in 1 or 2 years down the road, how will we say this has been a success or not? And if it's not a success, and that comes perhaps then as a follow-up question, who will bear the responsibility?
As regards the Next Generation EU program, indeed, it's a landmark program because for the first time, the EU's common response to the economic crisis is financed by joint EU-level borrowing. So it's a whole new concept. It's an ambitious program of 750 billion euros. And the largest part of this is recovery and resilience facility, which already mentioned, and the national recovery and resilience plans. So work there is advancing well. We have already 16 member states plans approved, and the Commission has given a positive assessment to 2 further plans, and we expect that actually next week the Council will approve also plans for Czechia and Ireland. So it will be 18 plans which already will be approved, and we are working with other countries to make sure that also these countries are making quick progress, and we really can move to the implementation stage of recovery and resilience facility. And we already have disbursed the first pre-financing to a number of member states, so 13% of the total volume of the national plans. So now the question is what it makes for this Next Generation EU, and notably Recovery and Resilience Facility, to be a success. Well, first and foremost, implementation. We have been working now with member states to ensure that they have ambitious plans, both in terms of investment projects and reforms, that those plans meet 37% target for climate and other environmental action, 20% digitalization target, that they address country-specific recommendations as they have been identified in European semester, that there are clear milestones and targets based on which we will be disbursing the payments to member states. So all this is in place. So what matters now is indeed implementation, because we have quite a compressed time frame. So in terms of commitments, it's until 2024. In terms of payments, it's until 2026. So it's important that now countries really move fast with the implementation of relevant reforms, with advancing relevant investment projects. So what will determine whether it's a success or not, how to measure? Well, first of all, there is overall assessment on the economic impact, which we estimate around 2% of EU's GDP if the plan is put in place successfully, and that it would help to generate 2 million new jobs. And each country has its own economic impact assessment, so how they expect the national recovery and resilience plan to support their economy. So we'll be able to measure whether we really see this additional impulse to the economy materializing. And the idea of the plan is not only to, in a sense, help economy to recover, but also to make sure that there is a structural change of the economy taking place, that there is a green and digital transformation of the economy. So we'll be able to measure how these programs facilitate to the overall green and digital goals.
And so the follow-up question, so let's say we come end of 22 or early 23, and there is an assessment or realization that one of the biggest programs, let's not name it, but one of them, for whatever reason, doesn't play out as planned. How would you, what would happen? I mean, how would accountability operate, and who would take a decision to perhaps change the program or even end the program, end the further disbursements? Or how would you see that play out? And what role do you see the Commission, for the Commission in that sense?
Well, of course, Commission has a central role in monitoring the implementation of the program and also on deciding on disbursements of the program. And in a sense, it is a result-oriented program. So it means that if, for whatever reasons, as you said, some country is not meeting milestones and targets in the program, it means there will not be disbursements which are linked to those milestones and targets. So it's very important that member states take the commitments they have taken in the recovery and resilience plans and actually implement them, because based on this, there will be decision on disbursement. Then, as regards if the need emerges to adjust the national recovery and resilience plan, such a possibility exists. It's foreseen in recovery and resilience facility regulation. In this case, a member state can propose adjustments and go through the same procedure of having the positive opinion of the European Commission, followed by the approval of the Council. So it's true that maybe in 2-3 years' time, there may be new challenges, there may be new issues, there may be some major obstacles for some of the intentions which are there now. So there is a possibility, if such a need emerges, to also adjust the program.
Let's talk about the repayment phase of Next Generation EU, which is, of course, agreed. I mean, there's a European Council decision that this EU debt will not become a permanent debt, but will actually be repaid over the course of 30 years until 2058, I believe. And one hope had been that there would be own resources mobilized. So various forms of taxes, be that the plastic tax, but also the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the emission trading system, and others, perhaps a digital tax, to actually fund the repayment of this debt. Now, as always, when one discusses a new tax, immediately this tax is spent not once, but twice or 3 times, I would say. And, you know, national ministries have their views on what they want to do with the resources. And so does the Commission. And for example, for the second ETS on mobility and housing, there is already a significant chunk of that revenue that is will be collected, that is foreseen for European, I think it's called social fund to mitigate the impact of climate change. So how are we going to pay back this debt? Will there be scope for true own resources that will be dedicated to repaying this EU debt?
Well, yes, indeed. As regards the own resources, there is as you rightly noted, the Council decision agreeing on setting up new own resources. You mentioned this plastic tax, which is already in place. Proposal on the carbon border adjustment mechanism is also already out, as is a proposal on the extension of the emission trading scheme. One proposal which is still not there and which is then linked with the overall proposal of the own resources concerns digital levy, because indeed we were intending to put this forward already in summer, in July. But it was very important to reach the international agreement at the OECD level on business effective business taxation. And the timing, in a sense, was very much overlapping with the final stage of these negotiations. So indeed, we had a lot of discussion on this, but the decision was then to postpone our proposal on a digital levy, not to, in a sense, undermine the international agreement on effective business taxation, or not to allow anyone to blame us for undermining it. And then actually to factor in this agreement in our digital levy proposal to make sure that it's not contradicting the international agreement, that it's complementary to this. So this proposal will also be put forward. So I can say that all these proposals will be there, and there will be those additional new own resources. Of course, we know that there is always a fallback position right now. A bulk of EU budget, I may be mistaken on an exact percentage, but probably around 80% is financed by member states' contributions, which is called GNI own resource. So, also this joint borrowing in any case is guaranteed also by member states and can be always financed by GNI own resource as a fallback. But the work on new own resources is advancing. I'm confident that those will be put in place.
Any chance or possibility that the repayment of this debt will be postponed in time?
Well, as we are taking the common debt in the market, there is certain term of maturity of this debt when it needs to be repaid. And also there, it was a clear decision that this is seen as one of instrument. So I would say the baseline scenario that this debt will be repaid as it matures.
So Alicia, did you want to ask something on Next Generation EU?
I'd like to make a comment again from my Asian perspective, because we sometimes perhaps miss the importance of the next generation, in the sense that what I sense here, for once, I have to say, after many, many years in this part of the world, is that Europe finally is taken seriously in as far as being regarded as a union. And this is thanks to this initiative. Not only, it's also thanks to, of course, a very successful vaccination plan, basically centralized decision. Of course, the fact that our borders, although we have had some instances where it wasn't the case, but finally are open, which isn't the case in Asia. If you think about what, say, ASEAN, which I understand is very different from the level of integration of the European Union, but still ASEAN has done on the pandemic is nothing. And they realize now that for once, as I said, because for many years it was kind of, oh, these Europeans, I mean, they've never get together. I mean, they have single currency, God, that's dangerous, you know, because they don't have the rest of the pillars needed to have a single currency. Now it seems like, wow, for a pandemic, that's the way to go. I mean, I'm not saying they would kind of go the way because they don't have any pillar to do so, but I just want to highlight the fact that for once, our plans, our strategy, our vision of being together seems to make sense in the light of the pandemic. And I think this is something we can't forget when designing or when implementing and perhaps then rearranging, as Guntram was trying to figure. Yeah, what if? Well, while we think of what if, do not forget, in my opinion, we Europeans should not forget that this is one of the most successful initiatives that others perceive us with. And that's so important for our image in the world.
I think we all agree on this. Unless, Valdis, you want to disagree, which I doubt.
No, I also agree. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Alicia. That was, I think, a very important reminder. So perhaps let me ask you one last question, which is asked by our fellow Nicolas Veron. He's asking, well, your portfolio as vice president also includes financial services. And of course, Nicolas being Nicolas, he can't resist asking about what do you think will be the progress we can make during the 5 years towards completing banking union?
Indeed. Now, of course, we have a commissioner who is directly responsible for financial services, but it's part of my broader portfolio as executive vice president. And indeed, banking union is one of the priorities. I would say some progress has been made during the last year when there was an agreement on some of the elements like concerning the single resolution fund, concerning some more specific elements. Right now, we are in a process, and Euro area member states are in a process of negotiating the roadmap towards completing the banking union. And I would say the president of Eurogroup, Pascal Deneuve, is putting lots of effort to make sure that this roadmap is being prepared and then being implemented. And from the Commission side, we are supporting this work to the extent which we can. Of course, one of the big outstanding questions is the question of European Deposit Insurance Scheme, where the proposal of the Commission is on table since 2015. Right now, there are discussions concentrating around so-called hybrid model of this European Deposit Insurance Scheme. And as always, there is lots of discussion on having the right balance, because that's where the view varies among member states between risk, what's called risk reduction, and risk sharing. So I would say if we are careful in finding this right balance, and all member states are willing to work, contribute constructively, we will be able to find a way forward.
Wonderful. I think we are coming to an end of this hour. Thank you so much, Vice President. Thank you so much, Valdis, for joining us today and answering a broad range of questions from trade strategy over Next Generation EU to even banking union. It's been very rich to discuss these issues with you and hear your political vision on these very important files. And we wish you, of course, all the success in implementing as much as possible in the next years, so that Europe makes progress. And as Alicia said, that I think also it's a good moment to also say, we have the EU has achieved quite a bit in the last 18 months, and I think it was noticed around the world that Europe on the vaccination front is now successful and is actually exporting more than most other advanced economies. So it's a huge success, actually, the vaccination program in the end. And also Next Generation EU has been a tremendous boost for credibility of the European Union. So big successes, but of course we want to see more successes, and as at Bruegel we come up with new proposals how to make progress. And so I want to thank you for engaging in that discussion with us, and Alicia, of course, thank you for dialing in as well. It worked remarkably well, talking with from 3 different places and having actually a live audience, physical live audience of around 50 people, which you do not see here, but we have around 50 people here listening to us in the room, and of course many more online. So thank you so much also to our audience for engaging with us. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.